Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Fire Dog Casey. Hello there. We have a story tonight about a dog that was famous in Grays Harbor of yesterday. In fact, he was just about as famous in Aberdeen and as much a part of Aberdeen as that other intelligent animal we told you about some time ago, Trick Horse Dan. But it was years later that Casey came to town, and he belonged to an entirely different generation of four-footed friends. Casey was a dog of the gasoline age, just as Dan, the famous trick horse of old-timer Bob Lowry, was a horse of the oak-burning era. And the gasoline age, which came to know Casey, also produced a phenomenon that finally took the life of this remarkable dog. For this story, we have to go back to the Grays Harbor of 1924. Do you remember that year? The Kraft Motor Company had just been appointed the Grays Harbor distributor for the Flint motor car. There was a red-hot majority race with A.G. Hopkins making the run against Bill Timberland and Jimmy Hood. Aberdeen and Hoquiam played a hair-raiser of a football game that Thanksgiving, and the lumber market was good. Eldon Wolf was an automobile man. He had been in business one way or another for quite a few years around the harbor. Service stations, garages, repair shops. He had been in several lines. He was working for Sears and Williams as a head mechanic down on South Broadway when he got Casey. Sears and Williams were distributors for the Nash automobile back in 1924. And Eldon got the bug to own a dog somehow. And Casey was a dog. Eldon wasn't what you'd call a dog fancier, but he took a shine to the little bullpup, and he used to take the dog down to work with him. It hung around the shop and got the smell of gasoline on its nostrils, and if a mechanic was taking a car out for a spin, chances were pretty good the friendly bullpup would be whining at the running boards when he started the car up, begging for a ride. As he grew, he took on a sort of an axle grease color. Eldon claimed from lying around behind the stove of the greasy pieces of burlap that he called home. Anyhow, the dog was practically weaned on gasoline and oil, and anywhere that there was a slick of grease and the sound of motors and the smell of motor fumes, there was a ready to make himself at home little Casey. How he happened to wander into the fire station is not a matter of record, but it was probably the gasoline smell of the big new engines and the roar of their motors that appealed to him. And one day he was in Aberdeen City Hall when the fire bell clanged and the engines roared out from the stalls of the firehouse. None of the drivers had the time to heed the appealing look for the bulldog as they reefed on the wheels and turned the big red rig trucks down I Street. So not to be left behind, Casey followed the engines at his best speed. It wasn't quite good enough to keep up with them, but it was enough to keep an eye on them. And when they pulled at the fire, he was right behind. He barked, got a sniff of the smoke, and managed to get under the firemen's feet as they unrolled the hoses and put their water on the blaze. Whatever a bulldog registers his recollection with, Casey used to make a mental note of this occasion, and from that moment on, he spent half of the time at the fire station. Moreover, if the big bell clanged while he was there, he dashed out behind the trucks and followed them to the fire. He paid occasional visits to the West End station on what Aberdeen then called Hume Street, and if he was anywhere in the downtown area when the big bell clanged, he was almost certain to be at the fire either when the trucks arrived or soon after. You can see that Casey was on his way to becoming the mascot of the Aberdeen Fire Department. More than ever than that, he was becoming a four-legged canine character in Grays Harbor of 1924. One of the scoop artists on the daily paper picked up a story of the fire dog. The paper carried a picture of the squat bulldog and told of his exploits. From that moment on, Casey owned the town. The children, yes, and their parents alike, were more interested in the bulldog that raced along behind the fire engines than they were in the big red trucks of Fireman Chief Bill Timberland. They made a speed run to the local blazes. As the trucks drove up, Casey would run from man to man, bark at the hose, was fed out, get himself in the way when the ladders were pulled off, and in fact he became about as much a part of the fireman's routine as the hose drill. When the last spark was out, he stayed around for a pat on the back and wagged his entire hindquarters when he was shown attention by the smoke eaters who now considered him part of the team. Several times the dog was caught under the wheels of the truck as they rolled up to the scene of the blaze, and more often than not he was licking his wounds, gained from an over-enthusiastic approach to the fire. His owner patched him up the first few times, then the firemen accepted it as their duty and took over the first aid work. And when Casey was banged up, he spent almost all of his time around the fire station, where he got more sympathy and in fact played the star role of the fire department. Well, that was Casey as people knew him in 1924. He followed the firemen around and almost seemed to be embarrassed when he met his owner on the street, probably because he sensed his lack of loyalty, for Casey was now a town character. Now, the month of November 1924 ground to an end of its days, and December started out with a cold spell. Folks stoked up their heaters and pushed the rugs over against the bottom of the door to keep the chill out of the houses. There were a lot of small fires because people were piling on wood more regularly and keeping the stoves hotter. Casey made almost every run on December 1st, and there were several. But that evening he wandered off in the direction of his rightful home and spent the night in his bed at Eldon Woof's down on Morgan Street. He was uptown early the next morning, however, riding up with his master, and he had hardly gotten into circulation on the streets before the clang of the big bell startled the town with the announcement of another fire. Casey was blocks from the fire station, but with the fire dog sense that people attribute to him, he was off like a streak. He met the engines at the corner of Broadway and Wishkah as they sped up west down the street, and he jumped in behind the hooks and the ladder trucks as Louis Hermie waved to him. The fire was at the corner of Wishkah and M Street in the big rambling apartment house that belonged to Dan Barber, and the first of the engines was already there. And as the ladder truck rolled up with Casey right behind him, sniffing the smoke and barking furiously, the number 1 engine rolled up from Hume Street. Casey didn't see it. He was watching the hose line being paid off from the pumper, and he ran between the high heels of the Hume Street truck, and the bare wheels of the engine caught him. They struck Casey on the hind quarter and bowled him over. They passed over him and he howled with pain. There was no time to tend to Casey, and the firemen rushed the hoses and the ladders to fight the fire. And Casey did his best to go with them. Painfully, he dragged himself across the sidewalk towards the fire, his hind legs useless, and pawing the ground with his 2 good front feet. More than 10 feet he made his way agonizingly. Some of the firemen saw him, but the back of the apartment was in flames, and they were working frantically to save the structure. It was a quarter of an hour before Big Bill Timberland got to the injured dog, and by that time Casey was dead. Well, as far as the men in the department were concerned, it was like losing one of the boys. They stood around the body of the bulldog while the driver of number 1 told of hearing his yelps, Then they recited over and over again to each other. They shook their heads, and Chief Bill picked up the honorary member of the Aberdeen Fire Department and laid him gently in the red car and drove back to the station. That wasn't all. The boys at Aberdeen Fire Department were pretty quiet that day, and when they had time, one of them made a small box, about Casey's size, and they wrapped him in a sheet and put him in the box. Then a couple of them drove up to the hillside overlooking the town and made a small mound under the second growth fir tree. Well, the next evening, Casey made the newspapers. He had the picture in the sheet and the story of his last run with the Aberdeen Department, and somehow every man, woman, and child in Aberdeen had the feeling that they had lost a friend. Most of them never knew Casey, but he'd become a public figure through the story and legend, and probably the best-known member of the Aberdeen Fire Department. Well, that's the story of the town's fire dog of a quarter of a century ago, and it's recorded in our hometown scrapbook. But we have a few minutes left this evening, as we do every so often, and let's take care of some items of unfinished business. We told you the story of the Aberdeen Elks the other evening, and we omitted the name of one of the few old-timers who was a charter member of the lodge and who is still among us. In fact, he is one of the first officers of the lodge. The man is Ray Sherwood. Ray's name was not listed in the old publications from which we obtained our information, but Elks records give us his name in a prominent spot, and Ray was a moving figure in the Brother Bills of half a century ago. And speaking of Ray, he was a moving figure in a lot of other things that might be worthy of mentioning. We recall him one evening as a member of the first rifle team ever to present the local militia, the forerunner of the National Guard. He was a county commissioner and a city councilman in Aberdeen and a handyman on the harbor's early baseball teams. In fact, Ray was about as active in early Grays Harbor that we find mentioned in our scrapbook as any of the old-timers would have been. And he's one of the few of the early residents of the Sawdust Aberdeen who is still active and able to recall those hay-filled days of long ago when Grays Harbor was pulling itself up from the tide flats with the strength and foresight of his pioneering residents. So our apologies to Ray Sherwood for omitting his name from the list of distinguished Aberdonians who put together and gave life and activity to the Elks Lodge, for none played a more vital part in this organization and encouragement of the order in its formative days, and few have lived longer to see it reach its present station in our community than Ray Sherwood, which accounts for this footnote as the bottom of tonight's page in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.